The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The blockade of the Ambassador Bridge was cleared this weekend, but Ottawa remained in turmoil as the newly declared state of emergency did not result in order restored on Parliament Hill. Tonight, what's it going to take to end the protest there? Then, in the pandemic-era shift to working from home, did companies find out they had too many managers? We'll consider that. It's Monday, February 14th, and that's next on The Agenda. Whatever else you want to say about the events of this weekend, following the state of emergency declared on Friday, and the Premier and Prime Minister again asking politely for order to be restored in Ottawa, and at the all-important border crossing in Windsor, one thing is clear. Something in our country is seriously off-kilter. With us now on what's needed to nudge things back on track, in the nation's capital, Stephanie Carvin, Associate Professor of International Relations at Carleton University. In the annex of the provincial capital, Janice Stein, Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management and Founding Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the U of T. And in Leaside, in the provincial capital, Matt Gurney, columnist for the National Post, The Line, and a contributor to our website, tvo.org as well. And it's great to have all of you with us here at TVO. And let's just fess up right off the top. If people are watching us at 8 o'clock at night, we have taped this earlier. So events may have passed us by, and we want to put that on the record right now because our sense of where things are at right now is that, of course, in Ottawa over the weekend, the counter-protest did grow. There was an attempt to block an intersection, prevent vehicles from joining the downtown convoy. The Ambassador Bridge in Windsor is now clear. Ontario, as we know, last week declared a state of emergency. And Bill Blair, the Federal Emergency Management and Preparedness Minister, said the feds are prepared to use the Federal Emergencies Act. The situation clearly is not yet under control. He said enforcement needs to take place. Police have an important job to do, and our expectation is that they will do it. All right, let's just I want to start by getting a sense from all three of you as to just where is this province at right now? Janice, start us off. Where are we at?
I'm going to say something, Steve, that may not be very popular. But what we are seeing is a real example of innovation. And that's why it's so hard to respond to. A group figured out how you weaponize large trucks and use that to shut down an entire neighborhood in Ottawa and shut down a bridge. You know how innovative this is. So because Canada is now at the leading cycle of innovation around the world, in Paris, in Brussels, we will see it in the United States as well. We are exporting this innovation to the rest of the world. But we need to give everybody just a little break here because they are having to adapt in real time to a new way of doing demonstration and protest.
Okay, Stephanie, you are there. Where's it at for you right now?
I actually very much, it may not be popular, but I actually very much agree with Professor Stein that this is absolutely something that is innovative and we've never really seen before. The idea that people could just use heavy equipment, trucks, vehicles, human bodies, families with children in all together and just simply blockade a downtown and key economic checkpoints. I mean, we haven't really seen that before. And I agree, this is something that is outside the norm. The people of Ottawa, however, are tired. We saw that, as you mentioned, in the counter demonstration this week. It was a fairly spontaneous, I don't want to say uprising because, we are talking about a city of bureaucrats. But the fact is that, if you can get the most boring city on earth in the most boring country on earth sometimes to actually stand up to a bunch of people like this, that that tensions are reaching something of a boiling point.
Matt, where are things right now?
I'm going to agree with everything I've heard so far, but I'm going to add two qualifiers. The first is, even though this was innovative, we were warned. there were statements put out by some of the organizers of this movement before they arrived in Ottawa that they were going to do basically exactly what they intended to do. So it was innovative, but the innovation was telegraphed. Also, I mean, I agree overall with Janice, but I would also just say I was prepared to cut leadership there a bit of a break too. Not well into the third week kind of a break, though. Like, this is innovative, but we as citizens, we as a democracy, and they as government officials who are supposed to be the grown-ups here, need to be able to show some ability to adapt. And I think what we've seen, I think probably for the first week or so, as best I could tell, there was a degree of, we could almost call it leadership paralysis, as they were trying to just sort of understood what had happened. Takes time for those briefings to circulate their way through. I think we're mostly out of the shock phase, and now we're into the confused, what do we do about it phase. So I will give them a bit of a break, but I think my break ended after the first week that Ottawa was occupied.
Janice, we know it is a tried, tested, and true Canadian tradition for different levels of government to blame each other, for different institutions and services to blame each other, but we are really seeing that taken to the nth degree right now. What should we infer from the fact that the feds say it's Ottawa Police's job, that the Ottawa Police say we need help from the province or else we can't do our jobs, from the municipality to anyway, you see what's going on here, and it's on and on and on. What do we make of that?
You sure do see what's going on here. Steve, that was some testy press conference, unprecedented really, by Bill Blair. And by the way, just as an aside, for everybody who last year was calling for defunding the police. We don't hear that right now. We're, in fact, in front of a demand for greater police resources. But what you're seeing writ large is the pathology of the Canadian Federation. You can't have lived through the pandemic these last 2 years without getting a much deeper appreciation of how fractured our decision-making is, even in a crisis, across federal, provincial, and municipal boundaries. It literally drives you to distraction. I think Matt's right. It took almost 10 days to 2 weeks to gear up that federal provincial discussion. Some of the stuff that went on between the federal government and the Ontario government and the Ottawa Police, if you read about this in a book, you'd think that the author was making it up. It is dysfunctional to the extreme. And boy, I sure hope when we come out of this pandemic, which we will at some point, we take a look at how we stand up decision-making procedures in real time to confront novel problems. The virus was a novel problem. This is a novel problem. It can't be business as usual at the pace of business as usual in our fractured system of decision making. It's just not fit for purpose anymore. That's the truth.
I guess the trick, though, Stephanie, what makes this tricky is the fact that, everybody's sort of telling a little bit of the truth here. It is true. The Prime Minister can't simply order the police to go in there and knock heads around, right? And the Premier can't do that either. He's not permitted to. And on the other hand, anyway, and on we go. So again, you being in the middle of all of this, how do you regard all this sort of buck passing from each level of administration?
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree with Janice just a bit when she says no one's calling for defunding the police. I actually think the confidence in the police has just been absolutely devastated by this. And one of the things that I'm going to be looking for is in the next couple of months is just the conversation we have about policing. I'm hearing from people in government, people, in the city, people, in the national security services. We're all thinking, geez, this just simply isn't working anymore. And we need to the modeling of policing we have and what we're talking about in a year is going to be a really interesting point. With regards to this, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of discussion about, policing options, responses, but there were some immediate responses that just simply haven't been used. And I've never really understood why. It wasn't until Friday last week where we heard the Premier say, individuals, they could face fines of $100,000, they could be arrested and sentenced to a year in prison. But we have some fairly basic tools that don't require multi-level of government coordination. just basic administrative law. The premier might not be able to direct the police, but the government actually has the power to administer driver's licenses, commercial licenses, and these can all be, taken away, suspended. And, let's face it, yeah, these are a bunch of people who are frustrated, alienated. I do think, again, we need to figure out ways to talk to people who think that the best way to get their point across at this point is taking over a bridge, that's responsible for a large fraction of our trade. But at the end of the day, there's just so many other tools that just haven't been used that don't require a kinetic response. These people, if you're driving a $75,000 truck or a $300,000 truck, you have an incentive to not get fines and to keep your license, right? Because this is probably going to be your livelihood. I think this is just a really important point that we're seeing, that we can actually do things that don't require a lot of federal provincial coordination. Why we haven't seen that, I don't know, and that's a question I would definitely want to put to the provincial authorities.
Well, just on that one, it was fascinating because that request went to the provincial government. It was referred to Carolyn Mulroney, who wrote back, oh my, that's not our process. We have to issue 2 warning tickets. That's what the system says. And these drivers have not been adequately warned. So it's going to take time for us to follow our process. That's the answer that came back. It wasn't that the suggestion wasn't made. It was, but that was the answer.
But Matt, we're under a
they could have started writing letters. We could have been on this a week ago. If you're not receiving letters or warnings because you're sitting on a bridge, that's not the province's fault. Again, this is something that could have been just done. And sorry, the last point I wanted to raise, Steve, that you said is, the government leaders can't direct police. No, but they can set expectations. Right. Mm-hmm. They can set priorities, they can set, directions. And this is what the province needs to communicate. This kind of, I can't do anything, this is just simply out of all the realms of my possibility is wrong. It's just absolutely wrong. So, yeah, no, we need, there's been a lot of buck passing. And I think this is why you're now seeing the bureaucrats of Ottawa rise in unity, which again is just kind of unprecedented in my time being here.
But Matt, if the province of Ontario passes a state of emergency, which they have, presumably that empowers everybody who needs empowering to do all of the things that the other 2 guests have just mentioned.
Well, yeah, presumably, but I'm going to pick up Stephanie's point there and run with it a bit, because I think she's right here. We can talk about the failure to coordinate among multiple levels of government. We can and we should and we will. But we also need to accept the fact that within the kind of the 3 spheres of government here, none of them have maxed out their own capacities here. None of them have done everything reasonable, even within their own jurisdictions on their own here. If the city of Ottawa as a municipality, or the province of Ontario, or even the federal government, whose powers are more limited here, had sort of gone all out and then it had failed, that is more when we start going, okay, well, how do we kind of bring all our powers together here, or pass emergency legislation? Up until maybe the end of last week, I don't even think we were doing, within the limited spheres of influence they each have, the maximum possible. To your point, though, with the emergency legislation, and also with the court injunction that was brought down to sort of to enable the activity at the Ambassador Bridge here, as one of my friends, a lawyer, had said to me privately, and I totally ripped it off and tweeted out his joke without crediting him for it. He just said to me, I'm skeptical about this idea that we have to have the courts order the police to enforce the law. That should actually be what they do. And there are procedural and frankly butt covering reasons that often they would want to have an injunction here. Yeah. But I think part of what we've been seeing here is not a lack of ability, not a lack of legislation or procedural powers. It's just a lack of willingness.
Well, let me get you to follow up on that in this regard, Matt. There are a whole bunch of disparate elements that represent the people who have done what they've done in the nation's capital. There is a small handful of people who are, quote unquote, the organizers. And then, I always like former Premier David Peterson's line, and then there are others for whom the devil decided to host a party and invite all his friends. Given that you've been there and you've talked to a lot of the people on the ground, lay out for us all the disparate elements that are there and why this has therefore been so hard to kind of negotiate with anybody to bring to an end.
Well, I mean, I think, Steve, it's even more complicated than you just laid out, right? Because we're talking about the situation in Ottawa, and I can talk a little bit about that. But I think as well, we also have to recognize that there was a situation in Windsor. There is a situation in Emerson, Manitoba, now in Surrey, British Columbia, and Coutts, Alberta. So this is very complicated. Even within the protests, specifically in Ottawa, though, I spent a couple of days there kind of wandering around, just eyeballing it and talking to people. And I described it in some of the reports I wrote as reminding me of Occupy Toronto in my hometown all those many years ago now, where especially early on, it's a bit of a party atmosphere. There's a lot of positive feeling, people coming together. They're meeting like-minded people. They're there to enforce change. But after a couple of days, other elements start to arrive. And one of the things I had written about in the Ottawa protest was that the protest right around Parliament had become sort of a magnet for the city's mentally ill and homeless population. So that changes the dynamic of the crowd. You have people arriving who are perhaps misinformed, but they're sincere. Like they are angry and frustrated and confused by public health measures. And then I'm talking to other people who were there explicitly talking about, and we must overthrow the globalist communist conspiracy that is mind controlling the prime minister. And I don't know if that person is mentally ill or has just gone completely through the looking glass here. There are, according to sources I've spoken with, this protest, even if it began organically, even if we set aside the possible manipulation of social media to sort of whip this thing up, even if it did begin organically as Canadians who are frustrated and angry, that there has been a drawing in of other sort of more professional protesting types who have now sort of become part of the crowd. They're either in the crowd or they're in some of the satellite sites here. Steve, you've already made the point. We're taping this before this will air, so God only knows what the next few hours will bring. It's worth noting that late yesterday, there was apparently a deal between the Ottawa municipal government and some of the protest leaders, until there wasn't. So just in terms of who you're talking to and who you're negotiating with, this is a really complicated one. And I think that I do have sympathy for both police and political leaders there. You can't pick up the phone, call someone and say, all right, let's cut a deal.
Right. Janice, I wonder, in terms of public policy making, whether it was wise, in your view, for the Prime Minister to take the military option off the table right away.
Yeah, I definitely think it was, Steve. And to go to Matt's point here, and that's a wonderful description of the multiple mixes that were on the street. They were on the street in Toronto, and I had a chance to spend a little time too. And Matt, what you're saying absolutely reflects the kind of experience. So we know, looking back, that recourse to military instruments to deal with a crowd of people that pose a threat to public safety. That's fundamentally what we're dealing with, as well as the problems on the bridges and the borders, at the moment, it seems so attractive because it's going to solve the problem. It's the after effect that are really terrible, and the excessive costs that we pay for doing that. I think there are many, many steps even today before the military. One, as we've all said, the authorities have to use the tools in their toolkit to capacity. Secondly, there has to be cross-jurisdictional correspondence. But if you actually watched the drama on the Windsor Bridge this weekend, it was better than high noon, really. You saw the police in tremendous discipline slowly walk crowds back until they were able to clear the bridge. So that's what I mean. It needs discipline. It needs patience. And we are dealing, in fact, and this is the big challenge, with a large groups of people who are there for different reasons. Some, frankly, told me they were there because they lost their jobs as a result of vaccine mandates. That's an entirely different group from the people who commandeered these rigs, set up elaborate communications infrastructure, are so skilled, are so disciplined. And we need the same kind of discipline in response. No way the military, in 4 words.
Well, okay, this is not an original point here, Stephanie, but the current Prime Minister's father, 51 years ago, faced a similar set of circumstances when a group that, they didn't know who the leaders particularly were, kidnapped somebody, tried to take over a city, tried to take over a province. And the military was called in, and they cleaned it up pretty lickety-split, and the FLQ disappeared. Now, some people are going to say, it worked then, why not try it today?
So I think there's a number of important historical differences. I agree completely that, calling in the military at this stage would be a wrong thing to do. In the second week of this, I actually watched the first time the police went into the Coventry Road kind of supply station. Matt, I know, actually tried to visit there and was politely received and told to leave, if I understand your article correctly, Matt. But the police went in, stole, didn't steal. They acquired some of the supplies, and then they left. And they were in shock. They were in general shock just at the reaction of general policing, right? They were instantly making excuses on their live stream saying, oh, the police didn't want to do this, that they, had shame on their faces and things like this. But, to the point that just basic policing seems to deter a large number, maybe not everyone, but a large number of these protesters. Whether that will work for all situations because there's now multiple supply camps around the city, I'm not sure. But I mean, I think this is part of the frustration that, basic administrative law, basic slow policing could really help make a difference, but we just haven't seen those efforts. So then when we talk about the War Measures Act, which actually doesn't exist anymore, we replaced it in 1988 with the Emergencies Act because the War Measures Act was seen as so draconian then and would certainly be now as well. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The provinces all have Emergencies Acts already in place for the COVID situation. It doesn't make it clear to me which powers would actually be invoked by this. I mean, the provinces can request whatever kind of federal assistance they want under their own legislation. To me, it would be symbolic. And calling in the military in this particular case, I think would be the military is not meant for domestic crowd control policing. Like, they're not trained on that. It's not clear what they could really do. Maybe they could use some of their equipment in aid to the civilian power with regards to towing things. If you can't get tow trucks to tow things.
Stephanie, can I just jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
The military has been called in for snow removal in Toronto. The military has been called in to help long-term care home residents in the middle of a once-in-a-century pandemic. So the notion of what military is tasked to do these days, you'll acknowledge, is somewhat stretched from its traditional role.
Oh, absolutely. And this is there's so many conversations that we've been kind of putting aside that this crisis is really bringing to the fold. I mean, I would actually question why we needed to bring in military in order to support our long-term care homes. Do we need some kind of civilian reserve force that can actually be doing this? So we're not always actually bringing in our military. There's been people who have been arguing this for a very long time. But if I can just get back to your original question, the analogy, the War Measures Act was invoked when you had a small terrorist movement, right? I mean, the FLQ had some popular support, but when it started engaging in these tactics, it started losing support very quickly. It was a very small identifiable threat. And, I think there was kind of a lot of support for that, possibly some of that being hindsight. Right. I think people in Quebec may have felt differently about it at the time. It was certainly a risky thing to do. I just think that, speaking to the different groups in this protest that I think Matt has aptly described in this conversation, there's going to be those who are going to use this as propaganda. So I don't think the military is the right tool. I don't think it would really benefit the situation. And I think in absence of the government actually using all the tools at its disposal, whether municipal, provincial, or federal, as I think we all kind of agree on in this conversation, means that the military is just not the right tool at this time. Now, again, we are recording this in the morning. I'm getting reporters asking me if the Emergencies Act is coming.
Well, apparently it is. I just got sent a text saying that the cabinet's met. The Prime Minister is going to allow for the invocation of the Emergencies Act to give provincial governments extra powers to deal with all of this, and the feds as well, but no military will be brought in. That was sort of what emerged from. But Janice, let me ask you this. Your job is to look around the world and put what's happening in this country in some kind of international context. You do that a lot. And I wonder if one of the things that we've learned from both January 6th of last year in the United States and and now in Ottawa is that a very small handful of people can actually apparently give the impression that democracies are being brought down to their knees and are incapable of making decisions. Do you think that's a takeaway from all this?
Yeah, here's the trap, Steve, for governments. It's no win, right? If you respond in a very measured way and you continuously increase the pressure, and we haven't really seen much of that, frankly, over the last 2 weeks. It's been very, very slow, as we've all said. The goal is to split apart the different groups that Matt described. And you saw it happen over the Ambassador Bridge over these last 2 days. Yes, with threats of arrest and fines, yet a lot of people just left. And then when the police line formed, more people just left. So by the time the final round happened, there was just a small handful of really committed people that were still there, and that was just easier to manage. That's got to be the strategy every time. The reason it's a no-win is if you escalate too quickly, you actually radicalize some of the people, and there's long-term consequences from that, especially in an age of social media. If you respond too slowly, you get weak and effectual government. This is a crisis of authority. The civil power is broken down. So you're looking for a very narrow sweet spot here. Ultimately, all levels of government are going to take back those streets. We're not going to be living with this. There really is not much of a threat to the civil power, if we're honest about this. The real issue was the bridge. That really got people going in Ottawa last week. That one's resolved already. In Alberta, the traffic is going. It's just one lane. That's frustrating. So let's keep a sense of perspective here and use the instruments that we have. It's just really tough on elected officials, this kind of moment. And you have to give the Prime Minister and the Cabinet credit. They did not resort in a visceral way to the strongest set of instruments that they have. I think in hindsight, Steve, just as with the FLQ crisis in Montreal, a more measured response would have been better. We'll look back at this and we'll say roughly, and I acknowledge how slow and frustrating this has been, but roughly they're in the right zone.
We got a minute left here. Let me give 30 seconds to Matt and then 30 seconds to Stephanie on the apparent paper tigerish look of some of our governments right now who seem to be incapable of doing what many people think is required in order to show that democracies can cope with situations like this. Matt, go ahead.
I'll pick up on what Janice was saying about having that kind of the Ambassador Bridge, right? The slow peeling away of the different groups, the literally slow advance of the lines of police in to kind of disperse people. You can have slow action on the ground at the tactical level, but I think you need swift and decisive action at the strategic level to get those guys doing those slow de-escalating actions a lot faster. You shouldn't wait weeks to initiate your slow action. You should have your slow action going in very quickly. Still calm, still rational, still trying to keep things under control, but you don't let it fester for weeks, because if there is a threat to the authority of the state, it's the appearance of weakness more than weakness itself.
Last 30 to Stephanie.
Yeah, it's been deeply frustrating. We are invoking the Emergencies Act, but, we have criminal statutes that can give people 10 years for just engaging in criminal mischief. It'll be really interesting to see how this plays out, if this is kind of a symbolic tool by the federal government to look like it is doing something in an age when we are all kind of screaming, do something to respond. But it'll be interesting in the coming days to see how the movement itself responds to this. And, I guess what I'm going to be looking for in really the coming months is the conversations we're going to have around policing's emergencies and, how we actually respond to a threat that really doesn't seem to have a name other than subversion or possibly sedition.
Stephanie Carvin, Carleton University, Janice Stein, University of Toronto, Matt Gurney in the middle. It's great for all of you to join us tonight on TVO. Thank you so much.
Yeah, pleasure, Steve.
Thank you.
For entire sectors of the economy, COVID-19 meant figuring out how to work from home. And as that became the new normal, managers in all sorts of industries faced some pretty big questions about what it meant to oversee a workforce that you never actually get to see in person, including, do we need as many managers as before? With us for more, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Dave Ulrich, Rensis Likert Professor at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. In Boston, Massachusetts, Michele Zanini, co-founder of the consulting firm The Management Lab and co-author of Humanocracy. And here in Ontario's capital city, Tiziana Casciaro, professor of organizational behavior at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, and Dan Bresnitz, co-director of the Innovation Policy Lab at the U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And Dan, we are delighted to welcome you back to the program, and everybody else, I think, for the first time. So great to have you all aboard for a conversation that I'm going to kickstart by reading an excerpt from an article that Michele authored in the Harvard Business Review. Here we go. By our reckoning, he writes, the cost of excess bureaucracy in the U.S. economy amounts to more than $3 trillion in lost economic output, or about 17% of GDP. Here's the arithmetic. There were 23.8 million managers, first-line supervisors, and administrators in the American workforce in 2014. That works out to one manager and administrator for every 4.7 employees. How many of these overseers do we actually need? The management practices of a small but growing number of post-bureaucratic pioneers suggests it's possible to run complex businesses with less than half the managerial load typically found in large companies. Okay, Michele, because you put that on the record there, you're going to have to wait and hear everybody else respond to that and tell you what they think about what you just said. So let's get everybody else to weigh in first. Briefly, Tiziana, what do you think about what he's had to say?
I think there's a lot of intelligence in what he had to say, and even more than the sheer number of managers, it's their positioning that is often dysfunctional in organizations. We have companies in Canada and in the US that are large, and so they justify a certain number of managers, but they tend to be arranged vertically. So you have companies that have 10, 12, 14 layers of hierarchy. That means that what managers do on a day-to-day basis is seek approval up and down this vertical line of authority. And that means endless meetings, the necessity to, navigate all these levels and all these lines of reporting. You can imagine repositioning these managers more horizontally, where an organization creates parts of the work of the company that are more decentralized, more independent, and where you still need managerial oversight and guidance, but it is arranged more along horizontal lines instead of being stacked up vertically.
Okay,
and this kind of redistribution would improve dramatically the use of the managerial ranks that exist.
Understood. More on that to come. Dave Ulrich, how about you? Are there too many managers out there?
I think it's the wrong question. You know, the clothes that we wear, the headsets we have, the books that we have, everything we eat, our lives, are given to us by an organization. How do you build an organization that takes individual competencies and creates an organizational capability? Management is one way to do that. It's not the only way. If you replace management, you've got to find other ways to make sure that that organization delivers value. So for me, the question is, how do you create a governance system so that the organization accomplishes its purpose? It could be through incentives, pay. It could be through bureaucracy, which is the argument that Michele and Gary Hamel have made brilliantly, or it could be through shared values. But the issue is not how many managers do we have. The issue is, how do you create an organization that makes sure that those books that Tatiana publishes get published? And how do you create an organization that makes sure that Steve's show stays on the air? That's the question I'm interested in.
That's a question I'm interested in, too. No, never mind. We're going to move on from that. Dan Bresnitz, your take on whether we have, with apologies to Dave, I'm going to ask the question again, too many managers out there?
I actually have to agree with Dave. I'm not sure that we have too many managers out there. I think that what Tatiana and Michaela have described is correct. We currently have too many layers of management, which the only thing that they do is managing the manager, but managing the manager. It actually, what Tatiana described to me, reminded me too many times of an organization I'm working with. The problem, I think, are two. We haven't, and we haven't since the very old days of Ronald Coase, figure out how to run firms and why we even have firms, because supposedly, according to economic theories, we shouldn't have firms. Everybody should specialize in what they do best, and we'll sing Kumbaya to the rest of eternity and things will happen. That's unfortunately not how it works. And indeed, the world looks more and more like Dilbert cartoon than, happy management, people working together. So I think the real question is what kind of incentives you give to what kind of people in order to become managers, and whether we have the right managers in the right place, and whether many of those people would actually be much, 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 much more efficient doing other jobs instead of managing 3 to 6 people.
All right, Michele, you've heard some of the feedback to the initial quote from the magazine article that you wrote. I guess I'd like you to pick up from that in terms of the direct question, do we have too many managers? And in terms of Dave's observation, and Dan's to a certain extent as well, that we might be asking the wrong question here to begin with. Go ahead, over to you.
Thank you. And I appreciate the feedback from all the panelists. I think it's incredibly thoughtful, and I actually agree with all of it. Because to Dave's point, the question that really animated us in writing that piece and then the book Humanocracy is, how do we create organizations that are as capable as the people inside them, as resilient, as innovative, as passion-filled, right? And so that's really the question we should be asking. And the reason why we then talked about and focused on managerial hierarchies and bureaucracy and all the trappings of bureaucracy is that is the fundamental limit on capability in most large-scale organizations around the world, right? And so then and if that is the question, then or the problem, then the question becomes, how do we manage without managers? So because the work of managing, of getting things done, as Dave mentioned, efficiently at scale is important. That will never go away. But can we imagine organizations that can do that? And be less hierarchical, be less managerially focused, and filled with managers who are not adding a ton of value, and probably not very happy in playing that role, right? So, and we think that the answer is yes, and we arrived at those estimates that you mentioned by looking at organizations that are able to be capable, much more efficient, much more innovative, with a fraction of the managerial footprint of traditionally managed companies. So Tiziana mentioned, large firms with 12 layers of management. Some of the companies that we've researched, and perhaps we can get into some of them later, but like, for instance, Haier, which is the largest appliance maker in the world, or Buurtzorg, which is the largest provider of home health services in the Netherlands, they manage workforces of tens of thousands of people with 2 layers of management, not 12, right? So if we can reorient most of our organizations to be more like that, where the work of managing is distributed and everybody really plays a role, as opposed to delegating a group of managers to do that job, we can get much more capable organizations. All
right, let me get some feedback from Dave on that. Do you agree that some of the best and most innovative companies in the world could be much better managed with many fewer layers of management?
Absolutely. I think Gary and Michele's work is brilliant. We not only looked at Haier, we looked at Tencent, we looked at Alibaba, we looked at Huawei in China, we looked at Google, we looked at Amazon. These are incredible organizations, not because of their layers of management. I'd love to ask the following question. And Steve, let me ask you real quick. I'll turn the tables. Name an organization you admire, top of the head, big one that people might recognize.
Okay, you're going to hate me for this, but I'm going to mention the one that I work for. TVO routinely wins awards for being a great place to work. And I tell you, as a guy who's been here for almost 30 years, I endorse that.
Well, by the way, that was the most incredibly politically correct answer that could ever be given.
It has the added virtue of being true.
Name one you don't work for. Name a company you don't work for. I'll do this quickly.
A company that I don't work for that
you admire.
Okay.
That you admire.
Apple.
Great. How many levels of management?
Haven't a clue.
That's the right answer. I don't care. By the way, you do know how many levels of management at your company, and your answer may be too many. But I don't care how many levels of management Apple has, or Amazon, or Google, or higher. I care about what they're known for and good at doing. We call that, and have written about it for 25 years, organizational capability. It's the capability of a company that allows it to be successful. So I buy an Apple, I shouldn't show this. It shows how out of date I am. I buy an Apple phone. I have an Apple computer because I admire what they're good at. That's the question that I think Gary and Michela have done such a brilliant job addressing in their book. How do you create an organization that builds a set of capabilities so that customers like Steve will admire them? Management, by the way, may be an answer. You do need to have discipline. You do need to have controls. But that's not the best answer. You create the right organization by having a shared set of values. And when it's often called a clan. And I love, Dan, that you mentioned Coase. I think you just slipped that in there to show your economic background. Ron Coase was one of the brilliant economists in 1937, wrote some great stuff about management of the firm that we're still trying to discover. How do you manage an organization so that it creates the capability like Steve just saw with Apple? That's the question I think Michela, you and Gary have done a wonderful job with.
Okay, let me bring Tatiana back into this in as much as we've looked at companies. I work in a public sector organization. I'd like to ask you about a public sector institution, and that is the university sector. You work in the university sector. Do you believe there are too many mid-level managers, too many levels of management? I know you work for an organization that's got $1 billion budget, the University of Toronto. Does it have too many levels of management, in your view, to operate effectively?
I think the question of the number of layers really needs to be understood in a bigger question about what is the role of management in contemporary organizations. We are still stuck on a conception of managers as exercising power top-down, where their job is to allocate resources that are typically oriented toward budget, approvals, orders, and things of that sort. The contemporary organization deals with environments that are too complex, too dynamic, too fast for that kind of top-down approach. And so the work of the manager has to change, and he has to see the manager as the enabler of the performance of others. What does it mean? It means that you exercise power over them by giving them resources that they value, they can't find easily elsewhere. So a place like University of Toronto is like every other large organization. We need to understand management as giving people learning, mentorship, the capacity to grow, do interesting work, improve. And these are things that are deeply satisfying to people and are not the typical model of authoritarian management that we're still very much holding in our heads. So U of T, just like every other organization, we need to shift how we conceive of the power of the manager in terms of enabling others versus allocating resources top down.
Okay, let's kickstart the next part of our discussion by my reading something from the Atlantic magazine, and this is from an article called Say Goodbye to Your Manager. Here we go. This came out fall of last year. With large swaths of people working from home, managers will be assessed not on their ability to intimidate other people into doing things, but on their ability to provide their workers with the tools they need to measurably succeed at their job. In order to survive, managers, in other words, will need to start proving that they actually do something. What makes this shift all the more complicated is that many 21st century white-collar employees don't necessarily need a hands-on manager to make sure they get their work done. That raises a bunch of issues, but Dave, start us off by maybe with this one here. What a manager does today in the midst of a global pandemic, compared to, say, what a manager did a decade or 20 years ago in saner times, with different maybe corporate responsibilities. Dave Ulrich, tell us how things have changed for managers.
You know, I think that quote is kind of silly. I think it's creating a straw man that's decades old to make a point. Good managers have been around for decades. and I think Tatiana said it brilliantly, the job of a manager or leader is to use their power to empower others. My ultimate test of leadership, and we've done a lot of research, but it's a very intuitive test. Do I leave an interaction with that manager or leader feeling better or worse about myself? That can occur virtually, it can occur in person. And it's an intuitive test. Do I leave feeling better or worse? So in a virtual world, which again is not that new, I think the job of a manager is to give an employee the empowerment, as Tatiana said so brilliantly, to do work that creates value for others. The job of an organization is to create an organization that succeeds in the marketplace. And so the job of any leader or manager is to allow an employee to do work that will create value for customers, communities, and investors outside the company. That can be done virtually, that can be done in person, but that's the challenge, I think, of good leadership. And it's not new. This isn't new. We've had to have leaders who don't lead by intimidation. By the way, that's why that quote is a little bothersome to me. Leaders who lead by command and control and intimidation, Dan alluded to it, they're gone. They've been gone in decades for good companies. And so we need leaders who inspire others, who coach and communicate and empower and make others feel better.
Okay, Tiziana, pick up on that if you would. Better or worse? That's one of the key features of a good manager today. Do they make you feel better or worse? Do you agree that that's the most important metric?
I think that it is a fundamental metric, and it speaks to the fact that we desperately need good management, especially now. When you have people working remotely, oftentimes, the need for somebody who gives you a clear sense of where your work fits in, the bigger picture, the purpose of what we're doing, provide a sense of feedback and direction to the people that don't have the natural spontaneous interaction that we used to have when we converged to a workplace, makes the role of the manager even more essential. And it is, again, not a role of intimidation, it's a role of providing tools that allow people to grow, learn, and connect their work to the work of others. That's ultimately the test of good management. Can you crystallize all these individual contributions into something bigger that they could accomplish alone? And the individual employee often cannot do that without a good manager providing that kind of orchestration, in a sense, of their efforts. So yes, I would agree. That is an essential part of the job of the manager right now, and we need it. It's not a matter of getting rid of all of them. It's a matter of shaping them into a different kind of manager that enables the performance of others, as opposed to pushing their own control over others, which is an old conception that needs to be eliminated as soon as possible.
Well, okay, just humor me for a second, Dan Bresnitz. I'm asking you this question the day after the Super Bowl, in which one team succeeded a little more than the other team did, and it's hard for me to believe, and Dave did use the word coach, it's hard for me to believe that some of the managerial coaching that took place in order to get to that game did not involve a great deal of intimidation. Is intimidation still a feature of managing today?
Well, I would say that forget management. People seems to have done the exact same mistake we have done in the beginning of the internet. Remember that internet will just happen and help freedom and will be spontaneous networks, and now we know that actually what the internet allows is for all of us to be tracked as if we were not tracked before. And this is exactly what happens in COVID. What really happens as COVID is that right now I'm in front of a camera, in front of a microphone, in front of my keyboard, in front of everything else. And if my organization want to know whether I worked or not, and collect a huge amount of data on which to give me incentives or punish me, it is so much easier than when I'm in the office. And it's going to get worse. I don't know if you look at what Google and Microsoft, and those are just the two producers, of administrative and, from MS Word to Excel to Google Doc, the thing that the new office actually collects on you and then gives to the organization is unbelievable. And we haven't had any talk about the kind of data that is collected on employees who has it and how we use it to control. That's a different discussion and actually a very frightening one. And I'm willing to bet on the side of evil, and that is that we'll have much more control and it will be misused by too many organizations very quickly. The other side, and I think Tatiana actually referred to it, is that indeed when we are stuck in our offices or our home offices or the kitchen in many times, and we're trying to concentrate and work without leaving the house, without ever meeting the people that we have to produce an outcome with. So white collars work mostly. Let's remember that people in factory actually have to go to a factory. It's very hard to manage it. It's very hard to motivate people. It's very hard to figure out how people that never met can work together. And you need managers that are able to do that. So for your analogy of, American football, it's very fine to have a coach that screams at you and tells you exactly what to do, but you also need the coach that then create the group feeling and actually allows you to know exactly where every other teammate on the field is, where they're running to, without you never seen them or worked with them before, so you can pass the ball. And that's, if you find those kinds of managers to do that on the internet without ever meeting the people, I'm giving a 10 to your organization.
Okay, I'm going to try one more on this with Dave, and that is, again, with this issue of intimidation. Amazon is an amazing company, right? They're one of the most spectacular companies of all time, and yet we have heard plenty of reports about, in some cases, how tough they treat their employees. Does that suggest that intimidation and/or toughness in the workplace is part of the secret formula for success?
Let me dive into that because it's a great question. What kind of internal governance system do you need so that my package arrives on time, reliably, at a low price? It's not loosey-goosey. It's not, Dan used the word kumbaya. Well, I think I'll come to work today. No, Amazon is fairly disciplined. They have strict standards because the customers will buy from Amazon because of those standards. Now, again, let's be clear. If there's intimidation, if there's abuse, if there's harassment of any type, that's inappropriate, no question. But on the other hand, some companies, because of the customer expectations, require standardization and discipline, and Amazon is a great case.
So, Michaela, we are making here, I guess, an important distinction between intimidation and just being demanding, appropriately demanding, right? We need to understand that's an important distinction?
Sure. But I think one thing that we're not touching on is that, even if managers are nice and they're not abusive and as bossy as they might have been in the 1950s or 60s, there still exists a huge asymmetry in the power dynamics between those in manager positions and those that are not. And that creates all sorts of pernicious problems, even though people might be really nice to each other, right? Even if you had a nice boss, you're going to think twice or thrice before you go and provide that person with some negative feedback, constructive feedback about their behavior, or you're going to push back on an idea that he or she has that you think is nuts, right? You're gonna, because that person at the end of the day is going to judge your performance, right, at the and determine your career trajectory, and up the chain you go, right? So what we've accomplished, I think, over the last 40 years is that we've made people nicer at work, and we have, the hygiene factors, right? I've kind of been taken care of, but the fundamental authoritarian structure that exists in most organizations is still there. And back to your original question, about technology and work from home and the fact that people have more autonomy. I mean, to Dave's point, this is kind of an old kind of old hat. You know, back in the 1980s, late 1980s, one of the leading management thinkers of all time, Peter Drucker, he predicted that within 20 years, so by 2008, the average organization would have slashed the number of management layers by half and shrunk the managerial ranks by 2/3. And the logic was pretty sound, and even more sound today, that, you know, workers are far more capable than they used to be. You know, they're more skilled than they were during the industrial era, and they're also able to coordinate with each other through the use of technology horizontally, as Tiziana mentioned earlier, right? So we have the capability of managing with less authoritarian kind of approaches, with fewer people who are telling others what to do. But in fact, the trajectory has gone the other way, right? So there's technology, and COVID has proven we can be much more decentralized, we can be much more autonomous, and we don't need as many people at the center telling everyone what to do. But whether we've learned that lesson, I'm not so sure, you know, because I think as kind of the crisis recedes, power will shift back to the center. I mean, unless we change our fundamental paradigm about how work gets done in organizations, I think we'll end up with what we had pre-COVID. And so, you know, I'm optimistic that, in a way, like, we have an opportunity to change things structurally, as opposed to just, motivating or encouraging the right individual behaviors. But whether that's going to happen or not, it's really up to us. And we'll see.
We'll see indeed. I've got 2 minutes left here, and that's enough time to ask the three people from the world of academia a very mischievous question, which is, you are all very good at what you are doing right now, but none of you is the boss. And I want to ask whether you all want to be the boss someday. Okay, Dave, do you want to be the dean?
Absolutely not, because I don't have the skills to be a dean. You might lose a quasi-decent professor, as Dan said. Careers now, by the way, no, we've only got a few minutes. I don't want to, and nobody in their right mind would want me to be dean.
Dan Bresnitz, how about you? You want to run the monk school?
No, period. I have no wish to be a boss.
No wish to be a boss. Okay, Tiziana, you want to run Rotman?
Let me join my colleagues in saying I do not. I'm very grateful to Susan Christopherson for having accepted to run this institution. But I will end on a positive note, because I think that part of the reason why we have a lot of people who can't lead differently is because we're not showing them that it's possible to do. We have run a study recently of middle managers in a large bureaucracy that are seen as completely incapable of adopting a new way of managing others. And a very simple intervention allowed them to develop their curiosity, which in turn allowed them to connect horizontally, much more thoroughly with their colleagues. It was done in the simplest possible way, very light touch approach to the change in them. So they're capable, they're eager to change their approach to management. So I think there is more room for action than we assume sometimes. People are more flexible, more adaptable than we give them credit for, and we should allow them to develop a new style of management as opposed to holding them to an old standard that no longer applies.
Well, consistent with that answer.
Steve, before we end, do you want to run TVO?
Sure don't. So
yeah, but let me ask you a question, Steve. I'm sorry. Would your mother be more proud of you if you will run TVO?
Because Dave really hated my previous answer that was so politically correct, I'm going to give another. And that is, I'd like to think my mother's going to be proud of me regardless of what I do. How's that, Dave?
That's very good. But
your
I think
father.
we have to deal with it. If we ever want to have change, people aspire to be managers because society then thinks that they have done something worthwhile. If you're not going to change that, you're going to be stuck with 12 levels of management.
We have, I think, whetted the appetite for a whole new round of questions on this. Alas, we're out of time, but we should have you guys back to pick up on this. And consistent with Tiziana's last answer, I'm going to thank you all horizontally as opposed to vertically. So Tiziana Casciaro, Dan Bresnitz, Dave Ulrich, Michele Zanini, it's really good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Grazie mille.
Thank you.
Ciao.
And that is the agenda for Monday, February 14th, 2022. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody, and a happy 101st birthday to former Mississauga Mayor Hazel McCallion. Tomorrow, we'll meet some remarkable young artists celebrating Black History Month, and hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.